This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. Today I'm talking to Caroline Young. I don't need to say that I'm a writer and film critic. I do that every week. If you don't know by now, I don't know what you're listening for. But Caroline has written a wonderful book about a subgenre of horror that, to tell you the truth, Caroline, I mean, when you read it, you see it everywhere. All of a sudden, you're just like, wow, why isn't this something that, I mean, or am I wrong? Is there a huge number of books about this subject?
There are not that many books about the subject, and but it's such a sort of common trope that once you kind of realize all the little kind of sort of similarities you see in films that are coming out now, television series, it's this idea of the kind of the older woman living in a creepy house and kind of the spinster concept. And once you kind of see it, as you said, you kind of notice it so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So sorry, the name of the book is let me get this right, Hag Horror?
It's Crazy Old Ladies.
Crazy Old Ladies.
Hag Horror. Yeah.
I knew Hag Horror was in there somewhere. Crazy Old Ladies, the story of Hag Horror. Yeah. How did you come across this sort of as a sort of a subject for a book? What made you interested in this specifically?
Well, I watched, so a couple of years ago, there's been quite a few films about sort of the later careers of actors. So there was Judy, about Judy Garland, Stan and Ollie. Also, Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool, about Gloria Graham. And it was also the television series Feud, about Bette Davis and Joan Crawford during the making of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. So I just started to get interested in this idea of what happens to actresses, sometimes actors, but I suppose generally women as they get older and actresses as they get older, and what happens to their careers. And I noticed that in the 60s, there was a lot of these films that were horror movies that kind of cast older actresses in the kind of the role of spinster, the kind of scary spinster. And as the more I researched, the more I found, it was a huge genre at the time, and it really cashed in. It was Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was kind of the starting point for those films. And after that, there were so many copycat Baby Jane style films, and they all wanted to have the kind of the sort of recognizable name, Tallulah Bankhead or Joan Fontaine or Olivia de Havilland. And it was just really fascinating just to kind of see how these films how you can kind of place them in societal context as well.
Well, yeah, that was what was so amazing about this book, was the way it's almost you really include the biographies of the stars in it. So you really get them in the context of their careers and the context of their times. And it's even though the films, as you make this point throughout the book, sort of some of the frisson of the films is kind of humiliating these old sort of stars of yesteryear. You use the opportunity to really actually elevate them as in their careers and in the context of their times. And I just found those stories absolutely fascinating, riveting all the way through.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was hoping to do, was kind of weave the narrative of their lives. So I didn't want to just kind of go through the kind of just look at the films solely. I kind of wanted to put it in the context of the lives of what they were going through, why they took on the roles, because I think that's kind of interesting as well. And, some of the backstage stories, Tallulah Bankhead coming to London, to star in this film called Die Die My Darling, and it was her last movie, and she was really suffering from ill health, but she had this idea of wanting to be treated like a star, and she wasn't needing the money so much, but I think they just kind of wanted a bit of validation. And the roles were kind of slightly humiliating, I guess, but I think they also celebrated them as stars. But I think there was also part of a kind of tearing down an older woman, or watching an older woman, somebody who was once very glamorous, very untouchable, seeing them in this kind of slightly degrading state, so degrading state. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so if we well, actually, first of all, before we jump straight into the movies, which we've already kind of done,
Hmm.
but just to rewind a second, how what's your story in terms of coming up to writing about movies in this way?
Well, I've been writing books for about 10 years now, and my first book was about movie costumes. So I've worked as a fashion writer, but I also look at pop culture and film as well. And so my first book was called Classic Hollywood Style, and it was about costume design in old movies. And then I've written a book called Hitchcock's Heroines, and I looked at Rome in the 50s and 60s in a book called Roman Holiday. Um, so yeah, so film and pop culture are kind of my main focus, really. But I kind of like, I suppose, weaving in a kind of a narrative into the way I write books. So following people's lives and kind of weaving their stories together.
Yeah, that's what was that really attracted me to the book, and as I was going through it just became kind of difficult to put down because
Oh, thank you.
because of that story nature. It felt like I was really I love the sort of gossipy, uh, the fighting, the infighting, the misbehaving Shelley Winters, being absolutely atrocious to one person and then really sweet to another, and all
Yeah.
of that was wonderful. And so you started off as a fashion writer, covering contemporary fashion, or
Yeah, so I worked, so the Herald newspaper in Glasgow, I worked on their website, and I
Hmm,
kind of covered the fashion section. And I trained as a journalist, but kind of film, I suppose, was my main passion, really. So, yeah, so the first books I wrote kind of combined the sort of fashion, but also the film, because I think film is really the subject. That was kind of what got me into writing in the first place. So,
right.
and I've been a fan since I was a teenager, or since I was 12, of old movies. So I think, yeah, writing about film, studying film is kind of always my main focus, really, and what I enjoy mostly, I think.
Is that and the old movies? Is that like a place that you sort of return to more than sort of contemporary stuff?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah. So the last book I've actually is just kind of in the process of being edited, but a book that's coming out in October next year is about Hitchcock and Edith Head. So it's looking at
Oh,
the career of Hitchcock and tying it together with Edith Head, because as well as working on 11 films together, they're I could also see the parallels in their lives. So they're both masters of publicity, both two of the kind of most recognizable faces from behind the camera, and they're both slightly controversial. So yeah, I thought, and they both, really have their own unique imprint on kind of aesthetics of film as well. So I thought it was interesting to kind of do a book on the two of them together.
oh, I can't wait for that. That sounds fascinating. And also we have Edith Head. I remember reading quite recently in a book about her sort of nicking credits off of other people. I think it was in Sam Wasson's and Janine Basinger's book on Hollywood, an oral history.
Yeah, she did kind of take a little bit of credit, I think. She was very much the master of publicity, so she put herself out there, and yeah, it did sometimes involve taking people's work and kind of taking the credit. So
You make
yeah.
so going back to the to Crazy Old Ladies,
Hmm.
which is a brilliant title. I wish I should have got that right straight off the bat. It's such a good title. Um, it's I mean, you make the point early on in at the beginning of the book of how this is an archetype that has existed, in culture for
Mhm.
hundreds of years, going back to um, the witch trials and the figure of the witch, and
Mhm.
then through to sort of more modern conceptions like Miss Havisham in Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, which
Yeah.
then comes into Sunset Boulevard and Billy Wilder, and you draw this line very very convincingly and very well.
Mhm.
Um, but you're saying like the first sort of full on sort of conceptualization of this is in Robert Aldrich's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Could you just give us a bit of information about that film, that just in case our listeners haven't seen it?
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of draw a parallel with Sunset Boulevard in a way is kind of I suppose, the film that you could say is kind of the start of it. But I think with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, it really came about at the right time. It was released just before, I suppose, the feminist movement kind of kicked off, and it cast Bette Davis and Joan Crawford together, two actresses who'd been huge stars. They really kind of funded the movie studios because of their great success. But then once they got to a certain age, and maybe they didn't look quite how they looked before, they were sort of cast aside. But this film kind of marked a comeback for the two of them, and it paired them together as two sisters who live in a home together. They're kind of isolated from society. They're both former actresses. So it really brought together these kind of strands of two older women together, kind of pairing off against each other. The celebrity notion as well. So this idea that there's kind of a Hollywood theme, as there was in Sunset Boulevard, and also lots of camp horror. So yeah, like axes and kind of bodies and all these kind of elements would all come together in later films because it was such a success and no one thought it would be a success. Robert Aldridge, he went around the movie studios and he was turned down, including by Jack Warner, who Joan Crawford and Bette Davis had both been really important figures at Warner Brothers Studios, but he didn't want anything to do with it. But then they discovered, it was such a huge success that it started off a whole load of replicas, people who wanted to sort of capture that magic from that film.
Yeah, Jack Warner said something very disparaging about them, didn't he?
Yeah, he called them washed up old bitches. So that's kind of where the title of my book, I suppose, came from, was this idea that that's how older women are often described in these films: crazy old hags. They're washed up. They're bitches. All these terms that they're referred to.
But how old are they actually at the time of filming?
So they're not old really. They're like in their 50s. So like in their kind of early 50s, I think. Yeah. So
as someone who's recently entered my 50s, I object.
I know that's the thing. It's like they were treated, like they were in their 80s, but they weren't. They were in their 50s. So yeah, it's kind of insulting to them as well. So yeah, but I think they kind of there's some opportunities that came out of it, but the opportunities mainly were kind of replicating similar parts.
And in you mentioned earlier the sort of Hollywood thing, because one of Baby Jane is the child star whose star has faded, but is still sort of reliving that former glory. I mean, one of the things I think that you point out, which is really interesting, is how your sympathy for the two characters sort of shifts during the film, because you think one of them is really the bully and one of Joan Crawford seems at the beginning to be really the victim, and then as it goes on, it's like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, definitely. That was the interesting thing, was kind of twisting the sort of perceptions of which one was which. And yeah, Baby Jane is very much like from Sunset Boulevard, like Norma Desmond as well, where she's kind of wanting to relive her glory days, and and it's just interesting, the kind of the final scene as well, and on the beach together, and it's just such a terrific film, and it's one of these films that you sort of don't get bored watching. And I can remember actually watching it when I guess I was, I don't know, maybe 10 or something like that. I remember I have an older sister, and she and her friends got it out the video shop. And I remember they were kind of watching it, and that was like, I guess, 1990 or something. So I think it's one of these films that sort of younger people can really enjoy as well. I think it's a sort of universal film that they enjoy those kind of horror elements of it without maybe knowing who the actresses are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing that we can't really get back. I mean, Feud, as you say, was hugely popular, and so that has done to some extent as a spark renewed interest in these. Who's your favorite, Joan Crawford or Bette Davis?
I have to say, I've always liked Joan Crawford. I love her 1930s movies.
Me too.
I'd say like Sadie McKee is one of my favorites. But then Bette Davis, watching her in interviews, she's just so funny. When you watch her, interviews in the 1970s when she's doing the rounds of talk shows, and you can see them on YouTube, and she's really hilarious and just very engaging, quite ferocious, but Yeah, she's fantastic, a real character.
She has the upper hand on Joan Crawford. You get the feeling, Joan's
Yeah.
sort of completely, she's into her Pepsi Cola and this slightly ridiculous idea that everybody has to drink Pepsi Cola around her. And
Yeah.
Bette Davis just absolutely uses that as, oh, okay.
Yeah. She was, I think she was good at winding her up. And I think Joan Crawford was very much all about appearances. And so, she didn't want to she maybe didn't have such a humor about things. So she wasn't very good at someone making fun of her, I think. And Bette Davis was very good at winding her up.
I recently showed a class an introduction to the introduction of her character in Rain. And that introduction is just like bam, bam, hand, hand, leg, leg. And it's like a musical introduction almost of this sort of like, or the dinosaur in Jurassic Park is turning up or something. It's like this amazing. Yeah. If you haven't seen it, I think it's on YouTube. And our listeners, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely take time, even if you just watch Joan Crawford's entrance. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it reminded me of her entrance in Strait-Jacket a little bit. I think the kind of over the top and her bangles jangling and everything like that, and the haircut, and it reminded me of Rain a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And playing on those, and you make the point that Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard sort of sets up some elements which go into. So, for instance, the use of the sort of real footage of the stars when they're younger. I've noticed that that's the sort of trope that has turned up more with male stars nowadays, that you'll see, I don't know, Robert Redford having photographs of a young Robert Redford in a film. So as a younger version of the character he's playing.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I hadn't actually noticed that, but but it was definitely, that was a big element of some of these films. So they would use the glamour shots of the actresses in their younger days. So I mentioned Tula Bankhead. So her character in the films I Die, My Darling, she had like a sort of box of mementos and sort of glamour pictures of when Tula Bankhead was younger. And then in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, there was clips that were used from their real films. So that was really interesting. So
yeah. What was I? It just occurred to me actually, not just Robert Redford, but the new Indiana Jones trailer has a de-aged Harrison Ford it's not exactly the same, but it is sort of like referring to the younger icon that he was at the time he made that film. So you have Robert Aldrich, who's this really, to me, kind of underrated film director. I think he makes. It's a point you make as well that he sort of his films are a series of great successes like Baby Jane and Dirty Dozen, and then sort of interesting flops. Like The Grissom Gang and I don't know if Twilight's Last Gleaming was a flop, but not exactly. It didn't break any blocks. It didn't bust any blocks with that. But he sort of continues to make these films as well. He makes like 3 or 4 of them, right?
He does, yeah. He did The Killing of Sister George, which I kind of put in that category because it's about older actress who is struggling to stay relevant. So, and it kind of shows her sort of spiral, her mental spiral. And also he produced Whatever Happened to Aunt Alice. And that is one of my favorite films in the genre. It's really good. It's got Geraldine Page and Ruth Gordon as the 2 kind of older women, although Geraldine Page is in her 40s, in her early 40s, so I don't know. But yeah, but they're sort of in battle together, and that's such a good film. And he also did one, which I've completely forgotten the name of now, the one of Kim Novak. He also made that one, and it was not a hit at all, and it really did very badly. And Kim Novak had thought it would be, it's Lila somebody. I've completely forgotten what it's called.
Yeah, I'm just gonna bring up the his filmography and see if I can. So we have Whatever, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte. That was Legend of Lila Clare.
That was Legend of Lila Clare. Yeah. So that was just a massive flop, and it was supposed to be a kind of comeback for Kim Novak, where she plays a kind of dual role. which sort of references the Vertigo, her famous Vertigo character as well. So, so Robert Aldrich had a really interesting career where he did these kind of very macho films, but he also did these kind of character studies of older women as well. And he did Autumn Leaves with Joan Crawford before Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and that was kind of the film that I suppose instigated Baby Jane, because it's where he met Joan Crawford and then kind of built up a relationship with her, and it led to doing Baby Jane. And Autumn Leaves is really interesting because it deals with an older woman who's feeling sort of like she's regretting her life because she never met a husband, and she's kind of this she's in her 40s, or I'm presuming her 40s, and she's kind of this slightly tragic spinster character as well. So
what do you think on a more general level is the sort of spur for this sort of influx of films about this? What's the, because you said Whatever Happened to Baby Jane's sort of slightly pre-feminism, of pre sort of post-war feminism, these continue on into the 70s and beyond. So what do you think is the sort of causing this fascination?
Well, I think firstly it was kind of, I suppose, the relaxation of the codes in film, the censorship codes. So I suppose with Hitchcock's Psycho, it kind of started this the horror genre where there was more kind of expectation of showing violence on the screen, and with those allowances of being able to show more violence, I think it led to more horror films. And it was also the introduction of television, where people weren't going to the cinema, and the demographic changed, so it became teenagers wanting to see things a bit more shocking than what they were getting on television expected to go to the cinema and see more thrills on screen. So I suppose horror films, or films that are slightly more shocking, became more popular in the 60s. I also think when I mentioned the feminist movement, I think, in the 50s, there's this idea of keeping women in their place. It was kind of, film industry was slightly conservative in a way, and it did have all these kind of tropes about how women were expected to marry. If you never got married, you were seen as a slightly tragic character. There were kind of warnings to women, and I kind of saw these horror films of the 60s as a kind of warning that this is what happens if you don't get married. You turn out like Betty and Joan living together as spinsters. And I think as the feminist movement was gaining ground in the 60s, I do think they kind of did act as a warning. And then when you look at the sort of films of the 70s, female characters were kind of secondary, and a lot of actresses have spoken about this, films of the 70s became very male focused, and there was really less opportunities for women. And so I think it was kind of just that sort of the trend of that time, a kind of reaction to I suppose masculine fears. There was the Vietnam War as well, which had a major impact. And then as you get into the later 70s, the genre that my book explores kind of dies out, and what you get in horror film is the teenage film, and you get the teenage slasher. So that kind of comes into the 80s with that. So I think you can kind of trace those strands through, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned the teenage slasher, because when you started, you were talking also about Psycho, and you include Psycho as kind of part of this genre, because of course, even though, spoiler for Psycho, Norman Bates's mother is the sort of what do you call it, the sort of defining absence of the film, and she is very much sort of an older lady who has this malign influence.
Exactly. So another theme of these films is the mother, the repressive mother. So and Norma Bates is very much that repressive mother who has driven her son to murder because of the ways the way she treated him. She kind of coddled him, or she didn't let him sort of function as he should have done. So and actually I think it's interesting in Psycho, she's kind of dressed up like a really old lady, whereas I think Norma Bates is only supposed to be sort of early 50s, but she's kind of like got the sort of bun and the grey hair and everything, and dressed like she's a lot older. So so I placed that as kind of also a factor in the genre as well.
I mean, that idea of age is funny because yesterday I saw a tweet from somebody that somebody had labeled a hate crime because it was the pictures of everybody who's in Cheers with their actual ages, with the actual ages of the actors, and they're all in their 20s and 30s, and I mean Norm and the post guy, Cliff, exactly. They're all in their 30s, and Ted Danson's in his 20s.
That's surprising. Yeah, that is, because you do think Norm is like, I don't know how you think he is, but you sort of just assume he's kind of an older guy.
Yeah, so, exactly. I think Ian Rhea Perlman is only in her 30s as well. Okay. I mean, and Rhea Perlman, you think. So even as recently as the 1980s, people looked a lot older than they, 50 was not the young portrait of Dorian Gray that I am. It was the portrait in the attic,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, with Psycho, you have this combination. I'm interested as well because you've already written a book on Hitchcock, and you're going to write another book on Hitchcock. That's a stupid question, really, but it's obviously a key filmmaker for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Hitchcock's films were, one of the first when I was looking at kind of watching older classic movies when I was a teenager. It was Hitchcock's films because I imagine I must have seen one on television, or so I think it was Rear Window. And I remember going to the video shop, and there wasn't really a great choice of old films in the video shop. So, but I think they had the kind of classic Hitchcock ones. So I kind of got into films of the 50s and through Hitchcock really. And I just loved the way that they take you to a particular place and time, and I love the style. So you're watching North by Northwest, and you're really kind of seeing the street scenes of New York in the 50s. And I like the Hitchcock's aesthetics as well as the kind of the mix of comedy and romance and suspense.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's so interesting how you get history through film as well. That in the sense that I watched those Hitchcock films. I think in the same way. Maybe there was a BBC Two double bill season or something like that.
Right.
And you don't think of the 50s as being 10 years that starts here and it ends there, and it's got and it's constantly in movement. You think of it as like a static. It's a bit like the Western, It's not those 20 years before the railroads arrived, and it's more like it was a million years long because of the number of stories, And the same thing with the 50s. I feel it's sort of like it feels more like a place than a time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and actually, I suppose the 50s did kind of continue into the early 1960s. I guess it kind of the aesthetics of what we think of the 50s kind of carries into like 1962, and then because you don't get the hippies until like 1965 of what we think of the 60s. So yeah, it's never quite the sort of from that block decade. Always kind of, but we always think it is, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think that's where Mad Men was very good. Was showing that transition of and how it didn't all happen at the same time.
Yeah.
And so we go from whatever happened to Baby Jane, and then you have these sort of copycats, which are which are in themselves really interesting. And then you have this figure who comes in, who many people will know about, I think, independently of these films, but William Castle, who is this amazing figure and character. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and what he contributes to the genre?
Yeah, so he was a director who specialized in kind of over-the-top horror movies that had gimmicks to them. So when he saw Baby Jane, he was like, well, I want to make my own one of these. And so he met Joan Crawford at a party, and he said that I want to make a movie with you, and I have a script. It's called Strait-Jacket, and this was one of the films that came out just a couple of years after Baby Jane. And he also did one with Joan Crawford called I Saw What You Did, which was about two teenage girls who are prank calling people randomly, and then a killer answers the phone, and then they get lured into a trap. And Joan Crawford had a very small role in that as well. But yeah, so he saw what Baby Jane was doing, and he wanted to replicate it because he was very much into gimmicks. He did whenever the films that he released, such as The Tingler, he put buzzers under people's seats in the theatre to give them an extra fright. So so he saw this genre as just a great way of attracting audiences and giving them the thrills. And Strait-Jacket's kind of ridiculous because they have heads being chopped off with axes in a very unrealistic way, and it's the definition of camp, that movie.
Yeah, he claims that Hitchcock borrowed his head for Psycho as well.
That's what he did. Yeah, I was trying to think.
I don't remember a severed head in Psycho.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's a skull at the end, isn't there? But it's not a severed head. So yeah, I'm not sure about that.
Absolutely. I mean, anybody who likes William Castle, I'd recommend seeing Matinee by Joe Dante, which is a brilliant sort of homage to a William Castle style sort of entrepreneur and film director, played by John Goodman in one of his few leading roles. You know, it's one of those great actors who has been around for ages, but always plays a supporting part, and there's a Harry Dean Stanton sort of figure.
Mm-hmm. I haven't seen that. I'll have to check that one out.
It's really good. It's really good. It's got also the woman from Raging Bull, Kathy Moriarty, has a really good role in it, and it's just beautiful. It's just an affectionate. This phrase has been used so much this year, I hesitate, but it's a love letter to cinema. But in its more lurid and sort of Saturday morning matinee sort of version, you know.
Yeah.
So no, definitely check it out. I haven't seen Strait-Jacket, so that's gone on my watch list straight away.
Yeah, it's it is it's fun, and it's interesting to see Joan Crawford she plays this woman who's been in prison for about 20 years, and when she comes out, she's kind of trying to rebuild her life. But Joan Crawford always has to be able to seduce young men in her films. Like, I think she has it written into the contract that she always has to, be still so attractive that she's seducing her daughter's boyfriend and that kind of thing. And it's a good one, but it's ridiculous.
It's funny, the trajectory of Joan Crawford, if you think about it, because she's making Mildred Pierce in the late 40s, early 50s, and then she makes Baby Jane, and then she makes Strait-Jacket, and that's why aren't there these older roles for women? I mean, nowadays you would look at someone like Meryl Streep and you will see there's she's still got a bunch of roles going on into her later years.
I think it probably depends on the type of career that an actress has had, but definitely, there are roles for older women. I think things have changed. I just think in the 60s, to have a romantic leading lady, she had to be of a certain age. She couldn't be in her 40s or 50s, and so the only roles were kind of these horror roles or grandmothers. So I think it was also, I suppose, the lack of parts for that particular age of between 40 and 60 as well. That's probably a period that's particularly difficult too, because it's kind of the in-between age. So but things have changed in television as well. There's so many at the moment. So many television series offer really good roles for older women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our concept of what is old has changed dramatically as well. I mean, Scarlett Johansson's almost 40.
Right? Yeah, I mean, So you wouldn't think.
No one's. I don't think anyone's been thinking, "Oh, come on, Scarlett, you're getting on now." I mean, she's 38. She's got 2 more years, but
right, so people wouldn't even. And then Jennifer Lopez. I mean, she's got her own thing going. She's quite unique in the way, but she's still doing romantic comedies, and but she's so powerful. I suppose she has that kind of ability to kind of drive a film herself. But Nicole Kidman. So
absolutely.
There's so many interesting parts.
Also, on a sort of lighter end, the Sex and the City girls and Mamma Mia, make it a plot point that the young daughters are coupling off, and their mothers are coupling off as well, and Grand Cher turns up. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, and I wonder if it's all to do with changing demographics as well. So I suppose maybe when there were less those kind of roles for older women, it was because it was thought that it was teenagers and men who are going to see films, whereas now I think maybe they're more aware of a changing demographic, so they're creating kind of Mamma Mia to appeal to to groups of women who might go to the cinema together and have it as an event.
Yeah.
And those kind of is it the silver dollar when they're talking about the kind of films like Exotic Marigold Hotel?
Yeah.
There's ones that are kind of particularly for older people kind of in their 70s, again, because they want to have films catered to them as well. So
yeah, they want to see people like them, they want to see a culture that reflects their own concerns and fantasies. I mean, it's funny because it's sort of coming full circle, because you've got Joan Crawford in the 30s where the audience is predominantly female as well. And you go back to the 30s and 40s, and all those films are sort of driven by strong female characters.
Definitely, because Hitchcock actually talked about that. Where he said he made films for women because it's women who go to see the films mostly. They're the main audience. Plus, if they're going on a date, he always said that on a date, it was always the women who made the choice as to what film. So he always had it in mind. He was making films for a female audience.
Yeah, you quote that. I remember that bit that you quote where he says, when he casts the woman, he casts her so that she's liked by women rather than that she's liked by men. She's attracted to men. That's a sort of secondary thing, which is it's interesting. I mean, you made the point that in the 70s, it all becomes more male orientated and weirdly, there's a real misogyny in the 70s which comes through, and I know that you can skate a line talking about if it's about misogyny or misogynistic, but bloody hell, the number of rape scenes that go through the 70s, it feels almost like that's from Diane Keaton in Looking for Mr. Goodbar to well, it's not really rape, but Jodie Foster as consent is definitely in Taxi Driver. Straw Dogs, obviously having a famous one. Every Sam Peckinpah film has something rapey about it. I mean that's something as well that sort of seems to be dominant in that period.
Yeah, I think it ties into, I suppose, to showing things that couldn't be shown before, but it was this idea of pushing boundaries further and further. And Hitchcock's film Frenzy, his second last one, second last?
Yeah, he has family plot after that. I've always thought of Frenzy as his last film. I guess it's his last good film.
Last good film, But it has a very sort of horrific scene that's quite difficult to watch. And he was accused of misogyny because of it. I think partly it was it was what was happening at that time. I don't think directors were kind of pushing the boundaries with those horrific scenes. And there's a film called The Killing Kind, which I feature in my book, directed by Curtis Harrington. And again, it has this really kind of horrible, very misogynistic. I don't think the director was misogynistic, but I just think he kind of created this film that was. So I think appealing to audiences. I don't know, trying to have the shock factor.
That's really interesting, Curtis Harrington, because he's a fascinating character. I'm really glad you brought him up and you include him, because he made Night Tide with Dennis Hopper as his first film, I think. And then made all this bunch of sort of British, some of quite cheap British horror films. But yes, this particular the Killing Kind is. There's one scene that you mentioned, which I'd like to bring up, which I think is really interesting, because it sort of goes to the nexus of sort of fact and fiction as well, and being an actress and being a character. Is the character, I forget the name of the actress, sorry, Anne
Southern.
Yeah. Anne Southern is the mother to John Savage's sort of troubled son. And he's sort of shouting like, you fat whore, and horrible insults, horrible misogynistic insults and body shaming insults. And the actress is kind of like, I don't like this scene, because it kind of crosses a line of obviously horrible, offensive material, but it's also feels like it's directed at her. People are seeing her on the screen being called this.
Yeah, that's right. And then Curtis Harrington assured her that he would do it. He did a take without those kind of insults being thrown at her, and then he went and used the one where the insults were. So but she wasn't comfortable with it. I think she was somebody as well who felt these were personal insults that she felt were being directed at her personally. So Yeah.
It is a yeah. It's. I mean, going back to what we said a little bit earlier about the rape scenes as well, I think it's becoming more and more apparent that when you look at the making of these movies, the actual cost to the actresses of undergoing these is fairly traumatic. It's not like, oh yeah, we did a rape scene, it was fine. It was like, no, this was, I remember reading hearing an interview with Susan George about Straw Dogs, and she said that the rape scene took like 4 days to shoot, and just that kind of how horrible that is. And I mean, Jodie Foster, when she filmed The Accused, would go out to nightclubs every night to sort of cleanse herself of this experience, And a film, another film that you mentioned in this context, which again is another film that I kind of never thought of, but of course it fits perfectly, is Rosemary's Baby, and that's a film that very much is a hinge between the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and interestingly, William Castle produced it and won an Oscar for it because he'd read the galley proofs of the book, the original book, and he wanted to direct it himself. But Robert Evans of Paramount was like, we think you're great, but we don't think that your style is really going to work for Rosemary's Baby. It's just not going to be good. We want Roman Polanski. So Roman Polanski came in as director. William Castle produced it. And what they created was this film that's kind of marked the kind of new Hollywood. And it was that bridge between the 60s and the studio system, and marked the end of the studio system in the same way kind of Bonnie and Clyde was as well. And the first of a kind of new type of horror movie, which you can see with The Exorcist. And it also kind of fits, I suppose, because it also this idea of the older and the younger generation. So the older witches and Ruth Roman as the kind of the sort of seemingly harmless older woman, but who's really kind of preying on young women and preying on their bodies and using their fertility. It fits in with the genre as well.
Yeah, the biddy horror of that. I mean, that's a fascinating. She has a fascinating career as well, because of course she goes on and does Harold and Maude, and which is one of my favorite films, and in sort of rethinking age and sexuality, she really kind of found she had a sort of second career as she got older with Rosemary's Baby, and then she did Harold and Maude and a number of other films as well. So and you bring up the point that she was blacklisted, so in sort of an intertextual way, that sort of is interesting, that in Rosemary's Baby she's kind of this counterculture to the counterculture, really. Yeah, that's true. So like a lot of the actors who in the kind of horror genre, they were given a second chance at their career because they'd been blacklisted in the 50s. So the kind of that sort of conservatism of the 50s, it's interesting that they come back in these sort of countercultural films. I love that film. I think I rewatched it recently, and what's so fascinating about it is, again, sorry, spoiler for anybody who's not watched any films. What you do listening to this podcast if you've not watched any films? Is that the conclusion is so sort of like, it doesn't end like you expect a horror movie to end. It's it's kind of unresolved, or resolved in the direction you're not expecting, put it that way. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, and it's sort of one of these films that's kind of creepy, but doesn't have the kind of the elements you maybe expect from a horror all the way through. It kind of is very sort of slow building, and and it also has we're talking about the idea of celebrity as well in these horror films, and it also explores the notion of celebrity as well, because Rosemary's husband is an actor, and his bargain is for fame. So and he's sort of like, I love the bit where they stay up to watch his advert, and she's so supportive. Oh that's great. And I know, exactly. Oh, it's crazy. And of course she gets divorced. Again, this is a point you bring up, which I love that. This is a thing. I love the way this weaves into the stories, is Frank Sinatra sending her divorce papers through because the filming's delayed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she was supposed to go and do a film with him, and then because of the delays to shooting Rosemary's Baby, she wasn't able to go and do this film with Frank Sinatra, her husband, and he expected her just to give up her, just to leave Rosemary's Baby, and she was like, "Well, no, it's going to be a great film, and also I've made a commitment, so I can't go and leave it." And when she said no to him, he sent her divorce papers, and then she had to go and shoot the final film, and so I suppose that trauma maybe helped play into the role a little bit for that final moment.
Yeah, yeah. God, what a mess. What a complete mess of stuff. Mia Farrow marrying Frank Sinatra. What craziness.
I know.
He would joke on stage and say, "Oh, I finally married a woman I can cheat on." And it's like, oh, you dirty old man. The steptoe and son would say. So I mean, one of the notions that you brought up earlier, and I'd sort of like to ask about is, you say it's about maybe women being punished, and so this, in some ways, this couches horror as a kind of quite a conservative form, because it's about punishing transgression, punishing the Exorcist as well. She's a working mother and a single parent, and maybe that's part of the sort of,
and an actress. She's an actress too.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, yeah. You talk about that. I think you say.
So it's again the celebrity idea as well, and
right.
The broken home, and this idea of celebrity is kind of the new religion as well, I think.
I mean, I find the Exorcist terrifying because it makes the Catholic Church the good guys, and I don't know if I want to live in a universe where the Catholic Church are the good guys and the guys you have to call when you're in trouble. I mean, I say that as an ex-Catholic. That's not just like animus that's unfounded in experience. Put it that way. But yeah, I'm wondering if there's there's also an argument to some degree that these films had an empowering effect on the women, even though they were seen as a threat. At least they were, at least the old dames got their roles, and they featured prominently in movies that otherwise they weren't going to get seen in.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I don't think I think they had a good time making them. I think it was kind of fun. They get to go and get treated like the stars, that they want to be. So, yeah, they go to a movie studio, they get interviewed, journalists come along and talk to them about it, and they get a chance to kind of talk about their careers, and they get some money. I mean, they didn't always need the money, but they got, it's expensive, I suppose, living a lifestyle, celebrity lifestyle. They have to have upkeep. So yeah, I think it's and it's also a chance to play interesting characters. So they got to do these kind of fun horror parts where they're running around with knives and axes, and so yeah, I think it was. I think if they really hated it, I don't think they would have done it. I think
There's a sort of Grand Guignol sort of aspect to it, which is Lady Macbeth or what have you. You can.
Exactly.
You can justify it in that way.
Yeah, I think sometimes they were disappointed by the end result. I think that was kind of. I think sometimes they thought that maybe it was going to be better, and then they were low budget films. And I think when they saw the final results, sometimes they felt a bit embarrassed. But I think generally the making of them, they had a good time. Joan Crawford came to London a couple of times, and Bette Davis was at Hammer Horror. She was working for Hammer Horror for a couple of films, and. Yeah, I think they enjoyed the travel and being interviewed and being the star on the set. So
being treated like royalty to some degree, even though. One other question. There was an article I read recently, and it's one of those articles that you read that you sort of go, "Oh, come on," and then you sort of think, "Well, maybe." And it was. It had one of these horrible sort of headlines, but it was basically "Stop using sagging breasts as a horror trope" was the article, and it was referring to, I think it was referring to things like it was referring to Barbarian, which I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to see. It's a horror movie on Disney Plus. It's excellent. One of the best horror movies of the year. And there's another one, The Witch, the Robert Eggers film.
Yeah.
And if you want, you could go back to The Shining and sort of the famous bathroom scene in The Shining where,
Yeah.
you know, it's a beautiful young woman and then it's the horror of, sucky breasts. Oh, you know, I mean, I know there's mold and decay and all that.
Yeah.
But it was kind of saying, oh, this is body shaming and it's a really retro sort of retrogressive sort of trope, and stop using it as a sort of shorthand for the horrific body. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose it keys into what we were talking about when we're talking about how do you look at horror in terms of its politics? Because isn't horror always kind of conservative? Aren't we always kind of, you know, the things we're scared of aren't the thing, you know, it's not like we don't check, you know, what's okay to be scared of. We're scared of the other, and the other, you know, that's not a great political idea to be scared of the other, you know?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I suppose also we're kind of scared of aging in a way, and I suppose the horror of getting older. And I suppose, this kind of idea of the horrific naked woman, older woman, it's kind of that ties into the witch, the concept of the witch, you know, from in artwork of the kind of the 18th century, 19th century. It was kind of witches were shown to be naked with these kind of the sagging bodies, and it was part of that fear of women as they get older. That this ties in with the kind of idea of losing fertility and losing identity, and I suppose it is conservative, but it is also, I suppose, a younger filmmaker's concept of what horror is, which I guess is that. And that was in Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby as well, with the witches when they're in there kind of doing the coven, they're chanting, and they were wearing bodysuits, the actors, but you see their kind of naked bodies, and this idea of the kind of sagging breasts and everything like that. But, you know, the men were naked too, but I don't think it elicits as much horror, does it? I don't know.
We just assume that men are ugly to begin with. That's
what it is.
Men are horrifying to begin with, and then they just get a little bit more horrifying. Gnarled, and I don't know. I mean, horror movies fascinate me, but they sort of play on your baser instincts anyway, I think. So, I mean, how could, especially, you know, there's an element of sort of disgust, and I don't know how you can sort of how you can sanitize that. I don't want to say politically correct because that's a bullshit term, but you know what I mean. How you can sanitize that and square that with your more progressive ideals, perhaps.
I don't know. Also, I suppose the visibility aspect of it, because I suppose people aren't used to seeing naked older people because it's not in culture. So maybe it's this idea of something that's unexpected or you don't see very often. I don't know. Maybe it ties in with that, the showing the unexpected. So
absolutely.
Maybe we just have to have more people, I don't know, older people being naked more often.
on that bombshell, Caroline Young, author, says that we should see more people naked more often.
So
exactly. That's the headline that we're taking away from this. Absolutely. I mean, I kind of, in that sense, I suppose it's liberating because you face your fears and maybe you should say, hey, you know, maybe there should be a scene in The Shining, the new edition, where Jack goes, "Where? Hang on a minute," you know.
It's not that bad. Come on.
I know. Right. One last final question, which is this is going to, by the way, this is our last episode of 2022. And I think you're going to be episode, I think it's around about 86, 87, I think. Wow.
Okay. That's
episode
good.
87.
Right.
And the last of the year. So Amazon will be having sales now, and other bookshops will be having sales. So you can go and get Crazy Old Ladies, probably with a little discount. And even if you have to pay full price, it's well worth it. It's well worth it. But what about a recommended film book from you, Caroline, that you would suggest other people go and read? So maybe a book that you know has influenced you or inspired you or you just like.
So when I was researching Crazy Old Ladies, there was a really good book called House of Psychotic Women.
Right. Yes.
By um,
Don't
this is
worry.
when my brain goes blank again.
Don't worry. I'm googling it as we
Okay.
speak. House of Psychotic Women.
Yeah.
By Kier Janice.
Yes, and it's kind of like part memoir and also her exploration of quite obscure horror movies, and yeah, it's really great that it kind of offers some insight into some quite obscure horror movies, but then she also ties it in with her life, and yeah, I'd really recommend that.
Oh wow! I'm going to ask her to come on as a guest.
Yeah.
That's somebody who has been recommended before,
Mm.
and yeah, it looks like a
Yeah.
fascinating read.
Mhm.
I've not read it. I'm ashamed to say. You
Well,
can.
you've got that to look forward to because yeah, you'll enjoy it.
I've got that in one hand, watching Strait-Jacket on the TV in another, and trying to ignore my saggy body in the middle.
That's a lot to do for the
I
next few weeks.
know, I know. What the hell? I've got Christmas to look forward to as well. Oh my God! Which by the time you'll hear this will already be past, if we get there. So, and your next book, you're going to come back and talk to us about, right?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So yeah, Hitchcock and Edith Head. And yeah, it's out in October next year, 2023. So
Superb.
yeah,
Who's publishing that?
it's Abrams.
Oh,
So
brilliant.
yeah, the New York based publishers. So
Oh
yeah.
wow, they do beautiful. It's going to be like a big, beautiful
It's
coffee
yeah, I'm
table
not sure
book.
what their format is, but yeah, it's going to have lots of images in it. So yeah, yeah, it was a really fun one to research. So
Oh, gorgeous,
yeah, yeah.
gorgeous. Get me on their mailing list. I want their.
I will. I will definitely add you on to my list of yeah people. I want to get the advanced copies of the books. So
That would be super.
yeah,
I can't wait to read that, and I'm going to go back and read some of your earlier stuff because it sounds like well, I just love your writing. I love the way you tell the stories, and it brings the films alive, makes me want to read them. Maybe read them. God, I get so mixed up. Makes me want to watch them, and
yeah.
it was just such a great book. So thanks so much for reaching out to me about that, and
Thank you.
thanks for and I should thank Elliot Atkins for the music, and Ali Howard for the artwork and the imagery, and thank you, Caroline. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.